Listen, thank you all for coming out today. I'm really excited to get to meet a lot of you, and there are, of course, a lot of familiar faces in the room, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And somehow the fact that Kings did this literally 2 blocks from my office is also very appreciated. But it's a lot of fun, and we're going to have a nice little conversation. I'm going to make a few comments here right now as you enjoy your lunch, and then we are going to take it up to the stage, and Mr. Brenberg and I are going to have a nice little conversation. We'll have some Q&A, call it a day. If you didn't get a copy of the book yet, the college has graciously made arrangements to have a copy for you all, and there are still some out in the foyer area, and I will be happy to sign one if you'd like. I've never signed anything for anyone in my life until the book came out, other than checks, both the front of checks and back of checks. And so now I've signed more in the last week than I ever thought possible, but it's actually been a lot of fun. And I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of where this idea of a crisis of responsibility came from. I run a wealth management firm, primarily headquartered in Newport Beach, California, and we have opened up another office about a year ago here in New York City, where I'm working from full-time these days. And it is a King's grad who serves as my executive assistant, who's here up front, Kelsey Thompson. Let's give a hand for Kelsey. And in coming out here to Manhattan from Newport Beach, I also decided to bring with me my wife and our 3 children. My wife, Jolene, is up front as well. So we call Manhattan and Newport Beach home, New York and California, because I am aggressively trying to lower my tax situation. Maybe I'm not very good at what I do, but I do give financial advice for a living, and this is one area that I apparently am not acting out of self-interest. The world of financial markets is what God called me to do professionally, and I wake up every single day literally within about 10 seconds of sort of being out of bed, ready to think about financial markets. I eat, drink, sleep, breathe what I do for a living, because although it is a profession, it is a calling for me, and I love that, and I take it very, very seriously. And I experienced something that I suspect a lot of you in the room experienced right around 10 years ago now. In September, we'll formally, CNBC will be running stuff every day about the 10-year anniversary of the financial crisis. Those of us that were well inside of the crisis know that actually the 10-year anniversary was last August, because it really did kind of come to a head in August of 2007. But September of 2008 is considered the epicenter of the crisis, because it's when Lehman Brothers officially went under, and from there the cascading effect that caused Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs to jump into bank depositor hands, in a manner of speaking, and caused Merrill Lynch to go to Bank of America, and Wachovia to go to Wells Fargo, and for a couple of weeks, and then the TARP passage and a lot of other events that took place, but you basically had cats and dogs raining down from the sky every day. And it was a tremendous and traumatic event here in Midtown and all over New York City, but it also was a world-changing event. I mean that very literally, and it deeply impacted me professionally and personally. So once the dust sort of settled and there began the inevitable process of renormalization in capital markets, I began a rather intense study into the causation of the financial crisis. I think a lot of people were interested in it. There was sort of an anecdotal, maybe curiosity that circulated, particularly for those that were sort of in the business, so to speak. But in my case, it was more than that. I was utterly fascinated by the chain of events that were required to create something of that magnitude. And through the course of reading over 70 books on the subject and reviewing over 50 of them, I came to the conclusion that virtually every narrative being written about the crisis was at best incomplete and at worst dead wrong. And I came to that conclusion not just from quote-unquote left-wing narratives on the crisis, but many right-wing narratives as well. More or less, if we were just to kind of simplify the point I'm making, the broadest narrative, certainly the leftist one, and frankly the one that is kind of permeated into history now and the winners write the history books. So it'll take an Amity Shlaes in 75 years to write another book to clean all this up. But more or less, the narrative is that Wall Street greed and an inadequate amount of regulation created so much leverage in the system, and Main Street got stuck holding the bag because of the greed of what Wall Street had done. That's kind of the broad, simplistic, reduced narrative. The right tweaks it a little bit, but they don't tweak all of it. They say no because of government housing policy, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Community Reinvestment Act, some of these other notions you may be familiar with. There's a sort of kind of a sub-theory in there as well within the right that the Federal Reserve and accommodative monetary policy helped sort of marinate the landscape well for a financial crisis. But in all cases, whether you want to blame the Fed, whether you want to blame government housing policy, whether you want to blame Wall Street, in all, the narrative is that Main Street was the victim, that the people were stuck with houses that they couldn't afford because of Wall Street, or they were losing their home because of greedy banks. And in all cases, there are certain nuggets of truth. Incredible bad actors in Wall Street, incredibly bad policy in DC, in my mind, very reckless monetary policy from the Greenspan-led Fed at that time. And yet, the most important part is where I think they all get it wrong, and that is the notion of Main Street being a victim, where what I would like to argue is that by and large, Main Street was a culprit, and in fact, the primary causation of the financial crisis. So I began going down that path and studying it and extrapolating it, and I hold to what's called the perfect storm theory of the crisis. I do think government housing policy, excessive leverage in Wall Street, accommodative monetary policy, a number of other supply-demand factors all had to come together in a sort of perfect storm to create the exact way in which September of 08 happened. Yet in all cases, underlying it all was a cultural narrative, which was covetousness run amok across the United States of America. It was covetousness at 745 7th Avenue, where Lehman Brothers was headquartered, and it was covetousness in any town, USA, where people were buying homes they couldn't afford because Mr. Jones had to have the house that Mr. Smith had just bought. So I believe that there was a sort of moral story to be told about the crisis that hadn't been told. Well, along those lines, then 2016 happened, and I began hearing more and reading more. At the time, I had an agent who was deeply involved in conversations with who would become my publisher for the book, and there were other publishers giving us the same feedback, that there was maybe a broader message at play here. Yes, the financial crisis illustrated what I wanted to say about the crisis of responsibility, which became the title of my book, but in fact, there was at that point in time trade agreements, immigration, technology, higher education, a number of issues that were being sort of discussed as the genesis of problems in American society, things that were holding people back. I, by and large, and if you read chapter 1, you'll see this, I more or less agree with a lot of the angst that exists in the present context. I'm not a populist. I don't identify as such. And in fact, most populism actually repulses me, to be honest with you. But I do sympathize with the fact that much of elitism and institutionalized attempt at a more collectivist view and vision for society has failed to deliver what it had promised. The great cry of my book is that those who are frustrated with elitist will realize that we are going to get more elitism and more statism and more institutionalism if we do not understand that greater self-government and greater individual responsibility is the real need of the hour, and in fact is what is most lacking in our present context. So through the book, I attempt to walk through a number of these different aforementioned subjects, including the financial crisis. That's chapter 4 of the book. It's the longest chapter, and it's the longest chapter because it was going to be its own book altogether. I think it would have sold 7 or 8 copies, and we probably wouldn't be here today. But the reality is that I want to approach all of these different subjects through the lens of what it means to put individual responsibility up front and center. So that's what the book ended up being. And to me, I think it tells a very important story. It does not say that free trade has not created certain challenges for certain people in certain situations. It does say that we have to look past that and understand in a broader sense what the right policy solution may be, and then what the right cultural response to that ought to be. I go through the subject of immigration, I go through housing, overall challenges in the future on the jobs market. Certainly the unit of the family gets a lot of attention in the book. But the underlying thesis is really as simple as I've kind of said here today. A remoralization and a re-upping of what a real sort of doctrine of responsibility looks like is the need of the hour. There is no tweaking to public policy that is going to fix that which ails us if it is an irresponsible populace. And in fact, as we talk more and more about income inequality in the country, you will see an incredible correlation, I would argue a correlation on steroids, between income inequality and responsibility inequality. And what you have is the top 20% of society not falling into the crisis of responsibility, going the exact opposite direction, while too many are going the other way, exacerbating this divide, which has such socio-political, economic, cultural implications. So we'll elaborate on that a little more. I have absolutely no idea what Professor Brenberg is going to be asking me about. We're going to have a little conversation now, and I'll be happy to take your questions during Q&A. Thank you all for being here today and welcoming me to King's College.
I was wondering why you signed for deposit only on my book that you gave me. I can see now it's because you're used to signing checks and not books. Thank you, David, for being here.
It's worth more than Bitcoin.
I don't know. Bitcoin was up a little bit today. Oh, well, so anyway, thank you so much, David, for being here. It's really a treat to have the chance to interview you, and I really do commend to you this book. I think it's an important book, period. I think it's very important for the moment that we're in. And in an odd way, it seems like a very provocative book for the moment we're in. If you think about the message of responsibility, on one hand, that might seem a little bit boilerplate. Well, yeah, sure, responsibility matters. But in the context we're in, the political context we're in, the message you're preaching and the audience to whom you're preaching it strikes one as a little bit dangerous. I mean, if you want to win votes or you want to sell books, typically your best strategy is to make Main Street the hero. You don't do that. Main Street in your book comes in for probably the toughest talk of any audience mentioned in the book. I know you want to sell books, so tell us a little bit more about your strategy here. How are you going to get a message of responsibility through to a group that is used to being called the hero, the little guy who has shown responsibility?
Well, I think the premises behind your question are really astute. It is very true. You can see this with most books that sell, and certainly with Hollywood. There is a protagonist that the either reading or viewing audience generally can relate to. It generally needs to be someone that they aspire to be or they believe reminds them of themselves. And so some book that villainizes trial lawyers, Wall Street, or government bureaucrats is safe and common, and for a couple reasons. It plays into a certain either class envy or just broader societal resentment story, which we get. The second reason is there's always some prima facie truth to it. Usually those different categories have some reason to be villainized. Now in my case, I want to make sure I don't sound excessively self-righteous. When you say I want to sell books, I kind of do have a day job. So I sort of have the luxury of not really needing to sell very many books. And I agree with you that in theory, if this were to get a very wide audience, I think it would run into a lot of angst for that reason. On the surface level, very few people would say, I oppose a message of responsibility. I don't like the title of your book. I'm against responsibility. I would like you to write a book more on how other people can take care of me. Most would not say that, and that's true. But I think to the point you're making, that as one delves into the book, the intent is certainly not meant to be provocative. I honestly feel I wrote the book far more graciously than I generally talk in my day-to-day life, which maybe says more about me. But I don't think the book is excessively or unnecessarily provocative, but it does call out, it does call to account many of those in the present society that would present themselves as victims, and it asks them to stop, to recognize that they're doing it. This is where sort of the right-wing, left-wing thing comes in, Brian, because I sort of grew up believing that the left did this, that the left blame casted, that there was some external force responsible for the plight of the key voting demographics that they were most appealing to, and that the message of the right, the message of the conservatism that I believed in was different. Well, I do still believe that ideologically, but I think practically speaking, so much of the right has fallen into blame casting as well. But the key difference is that the targets of the blame casting are categorically different. And so as in a more generic sense, you see these populists that are mad at globalist and elitist. You see the left that is still mad at big business and big banks and Wall Street and that and so forth. And then the right, more or less, some kind of vacillates, although it gets lumped together, but it's usually government and media. And there's, again, nuggets of truth to all of it. There's legitimacy in those complaints. What I'm trying to do in the book is challenge people to dig further as to where government cannot be a scapegoat for everything going wrong in our lives.
So David isn't trying to be provocative necessarily with his book. I want to ask some provocative questions, though, because I think you get to some provocative themes. And one of them, as I read the book, I was struck by a parallel. You think about Europe for a second, and you think about missionary experiences in Europe trying to preach Christianity. And any missionary will tell you it's very difficult to preach Christianity in Europe because it's a post-Christian society. And as I read this book, I couldn't help but think, in preaching responsibility, primarily to the right, I mean, that's who you're preaching to in this book, are we sort of saying we're in something of a post-responsibility society when it comes to the right in America? I mean, do you have that sense that we might be more far gone on this issue than we want to admit or even realize?
I think that there is a very good chance that, and I am an eternal optimist, and more or less most of the speaking, writing, and thinking that I do is rooted in a deep optimism. I will say that I think that it's very likely that we are in a post-responsibility culture at this point in time. Now, there's some interesting things at play there as I say that. I sort of historically would argue that most of this degradation of responsibility in the individual self and in the family and then in our communities more or less started in the mid-1960s. So you're not talking about ancient history. Let's give it a 50-year timeline. And I'm an incrementalist. I believe that things that incrementally eroded can be incrementally put back together. So would it be the end of the world if it took 50 years to start to see self-correcting mechanisms in society around this crisis of responsibility? I think we could live with that. I think our country could withstand it. But is that to say it has to take 50 years, that we're in a post-responsibility culture? See, that part gets trickier. And I know it's a sort of odd analogy, but it's one I've thought about quite a bit in the last few weeks. If you go back to middle of October 2017, does anyone think that's ancient history? You know, you're talking about 3 or 4 months ago, and a day that this little op-ed, or news story hit the New York Times with some shocking revelations about the personal behavior of one Harvey Weinstein. I'm telling you, I have never in my life, as a news junkie, seen something so quickly unravel as the way that this Me Too movement has gone. Virtually overnight, the culture has, and there, of course you could argue that there's even kind of an excess in the response to it and so forth. But right now, so much of the behavior that is characterized a lot of male-female relationships in the workplace and in Hollywood and in different settings categorically changed instantly. The cultural conversation changed instantly. I would not argue that such a Me Too moment is coming for the responsibility movement, but I would argue that God could do it. And I would argue that there are catalysts in the culture that could help accelerate it. I don't believe the church is preaching this message. And if they were, I think that that would go a long way. And I truly don't believe politicians are saying it. And then you talk about someone having a challenge selling books. If you want to find out a formula for how to lose an election, it would be to go suggest that the problem is with the people and not the leaders and so forth. But see, once you go down that path, if you say government is the cause of all the problems, you have to argue that they're the cure. You've logically boxed yourself in. So I don't believe government is the cure to all of our problems, and therefore I can't argue that they're the cause. Now, we have to get the policy prescriptions right. The very heavy degree of polarization and tribalism we have right now, I am optimistic that that will settle. It's somewhat unsustainable, I think, for a society. If it doesn't settle, I think that that we have a lot worse things in store than just what we're talking about today.
You talk about this fixation with the elites. The elites have become one of these amorphous external forces that seem to shape, all the lives of those on Main Street. But your point is, and I think this is an important point, the more you talk about the elites, the more that people focus on the elites, the more power you cede to whatever those elite forces actually are. And you're not actually making any gains for Main Street. You're actually boxing Main Street more and more into a corner.
That's right. There's a almost accidental, it's an implicit kind of nod to statism and to elitism, how much power people will grant to them. And in almost any tragedy that takes place and in most events in public life, the knee-jerk reaction of left and right is government needs to do something. I think that stems from the belief, as I argue in chapter 10 of the book, that the individual doesn't need to do something. I think that the founders completely predicted this. They wrote about it with great moral clarity, that the framework of government, which I believe to be the greatest ever invented in world history, was very specifically meant for responsible people. And so that self-government was a kind of sine qua non to the way they wanted to formulate civic life. Now I believe that the kind of general conversation about a strong man who is going to come in and fix this, fix that, and so forth, what undergirds it is effectively a belief in big governmentism. Right now we're all mad at it, so we can focus in the populist rage, but when you come out the other side, more or less we've kind of suggested we do want elites and strong men to come fix the problem.
You write about this fascination with federal politics, and on the other hand, almost the complete abandonment of local politics. And I mean, you get it at one level. There's a drama and a soap opera to federal politics, national politics, that, look, we're all sort of soap opera watchers now. Local politics is, there's a story there as well, but it's much more about zoning requirements. Can I get a building built? But you argue that's actually the locus of change, and that's more properly the place where our attention ought to be fixed. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's actually one of the more kind of practical solutions offered, and earlier in the book there's a bit of elaboration as to why this issue is so significant. But I believe that our obsession with federal politics is also itself a nod to a large federal behemoth, a bureaucracy in D.C. And our abandonment of local politics, it isn't interesting, and more or less most people that are willing to go serve at a local level, I'm talking about a city, county, school district, all the way up to state, most people willing to serve in that capacity are subpar, and most people that are interested in engaging it and being involved with it and being aware, first of all, it's a very tiny minority, but it doesn't represent the best and brightest of what we have to offer. And that's a pretty much universally true statement. Now, imagine a society that is more like what I'm hoping for, that I believe to be the ideal. Tell me how you end up with the same degree of incompetence and maybe even sometimes evil in federal government if local government is ticking away the way it's supposed to. How is it even possible if the most competent, the most ethically capable, ethically impressive people are serving at those local levels? First of all, local politics is almost always the farm team for who goes on to serve in Congress and Senate, and certainly at higher levels of state politics. So you're just populating the whole farm team with future leaders that come from are cut from a totally different cloth. But also you've created that much more engagement, and you've asserted that much more responsibility in the community on the great issues. So a community and a school district being able to come up with the right policy around protecting their schools can now be done by bright and morally capable people, and we don't have to have the utterly nonsensical conversation that Washington, D.C. is going to fix school security at an elementary school in Colorado or a high school in Florida. Local leadership, ground up, needs to become a much bigger part of our priority.
So I'm going to violate what I just talked about in terms of the importance of local politics, and I'm going to jump back to a national issue, but only because I want to get out there a couple of the specific things you addressed. One of my favorite chapters was on immigration, and it's because you wrote something in that chapter that I found to be very provocative, and I think what makes for an interesting conversation. You're talking about some of the economic conversation around immigration and what effect that has on native populations and work opportunities. And you write this: only a crisis of responsibility would allow a worker to conclude that there are less educated, less capable workers of another ethnicity doing work for less than what I would like to be paid, so I give up. You go on to say, just a little bit later in the book, only a crisis of responsibility could assert that what is keeping the native working class from a chance at success is the presence of mostly unskilled, uneducated laborers. That is a strong statement about some of the economic arguments you hear against immigration. And yet it strikes me as probably the right prescription, but it's not going to be easy to hear if you're on the other side of the issue from where you are. Talk about that statement and how you think through it.
Yeah, part of me doesn't want to go back to California to do these events next week because I assure you my message on immigration is much more unpopular in Southern California than it is here in Manhattan, so I'm able to get away with it a little more here. It's a very heated issue, and I do believe that the whole treatment of the chapter you'll find is, I'm not trying to kind of beat around the bush. I'm taking a very direct path to what I strongly feel about the issue, but there's a number of kind of presuppositions that need to be laid out about immigration as it pertains to patriotism, as it pertains to cultural assimilation, as it pertains to national security. So I have strong views on the subject, but what I have equally strong views on is the idea that there is an American worker who cannot get ahead because there is an illegal immigrant standing in their way. First of all, before we get to the point that Brian's reading from, it's economically preposterous. Now, I have no chance of winning that argument in the court of public opinion. You can't go through Economics 201 with people that are probably not familiar with Economics 1. You understand that for every immigrant who comes in who's competing for a job, they are also a customer. Okay, so the economy has grown. The denominator has grown just as the numerator has. So there is a whole misunderstanding around what really takes place in the larger subject of immigration. Most economic arguments used against illegal immigration really would be arguments against legal immigration, and they just simply are luckily or fortunately not willing to be logically consistent enough to carry that through. But to the point I think you're getting to, I stand by that, and that exact verbiage, tooth and nail. It is unacceptable for the American society that is built on what we are built on, has been paid for by the blood that was shed to build this land of opportunity, for anyone to say that I am unable to compete in the job market at the scale in which we are talking about. I think that there is a need for reinvention at times. There is a need for geographical mobility. There's a heavy theme in 2 different chapters of the book on labor dynamism, what that looks like. But I'm referring to that moral statement of fact that says, I'm willing to become a ward of the state via food stamps or welfare, and I'm willing to play video games till 3 in the afternoon. I'm willing to sleep in mom's basement till I'm 36 years old, because there is an immigrant who's getting up at 5 in the morning and he'll work for less than I will. Now look, that is what's happening. That's what the conversation is, culturally. That's what's happening. I understand there's policy complexity around exactly what we want immigration to look like, quantity, quality, national security. There's a whole lot of things that need to be parsed through, and we talk about some of that broadly in the book. But the idea that first and foremost, the American worker simply cannot survive because of it is so untrue economically, as a matter of fact, and antithetical to our own history as a country, that I believe it needs to be pushed back against.
So I want to go to questions from the audience in just a second if you have one, but let me ask you about one more issue of the day that's actually not addressed in the book, but it strikes me as consistent or flowing from the message of the book, and that has to do with everything we're hearing about Facebook and Russian meddling in the election, and some of the conversation around how much has that influenced how people thought about the election, and what should we do about it? You're hearing a lot of calls now about regulating Facebook, regulating the messages, breaking Facebook or other organizations like that up because of the influence that they have. That strikes me, that whole conversation actually strikes me again as a conversation rooted in responsibility, and what responsibility we have, Main Street has, to think through the messages we're imbibing and that we're using to make decisions in our own personal life or political life. Do you see the connection there?
Oh, I do, absolutely. And it's funny. First of all, have you noticed how many people go to Facebook to complain about Facebook's ads? I myself, at about 4:30 this morning, posted something on Facebook about this very subject. To the degree one believes that Russians ran ads on Facebook suggesting Hillary was in some, naughty ring at a pizza parlor or something, and that caused people who were going to vote for Hillary, then they saw this Facebook ad and decided to vote for Trump. If that were really the case, then we're arguing about the wrong thing. The country is lost anyways. It's a crisis of responsibility on steroids if Facebook ads are able to have that kind of power. But I think that what you're alluding to is actually in very early innings, and where it's going to be more potent, I think, is around a lot of smartphone technology, and there's a lot of pressure right now on Apple to limit kids' usage, teenagers. There's, just as we saw a lot of the lawsuits with tobacco companies, people started dying from lung cancer. I think you're going to start seeing there be lawsuits against Apple for kids who are addicted to their smartphone and so forth. I don't say this dramatically. I really believe it. I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen systemically. And it starts where? It starts, of course, in the society that has said that these young adults, teenagers, people are not, or parents, are not responsible in their own home unit for these types of things. So now you do have it. Admittedly, it's new tech. It isn't something we've dealt with before, although as a reader of Ecclesiastes, I always believe we've sort of dealt with it before. It's manifested differently, but I think we've had these conversations when the television, cable TV, the automobile, throughout history, there's been various conventions that challenged how we kind of relate to one another in society. But fundamentally, you are going to see an incredible invite for statism around technology. It's going to massively change the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. I actually think it's going to be kind of humorous to watch because these have been very friendly bedfellows for a long time, and I think that's going to change. And one of the National Review Fellows, Victor Davis Hansen's written some wonderful stuff about this subject. But I think it is another symptom of what I'm describing as a crisis of responsibility. There are no problems with the mere, there's complexity, but there are no problems around the advent of new technologies that responsible and right-sized culture would not be able to address.
I'd just add, you mentioned this could drive a wedge between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. It could also bring them really, really close together. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that Jeff Bezos is considering Washington, D.C. as the potential site for, HQ2 for Amazon. It would be awfully helpful for him to be right next door when he's trying to navigate a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think that probably the better play for Mr. Bezos would be a less expensive place with more access to technology, labor, and then to go put a big lobbying firm in the middle of Washington, D.C. And by the way, if you're ever interested at looking at, to your point, the money spent on lobbying, they have to disclose it in every 10Q and 10K that Google, Facebook, Amazon, these companies have spent. It's exploded, hundreds of percent, quarter over quarter increase in lobbying. So this is a real issue that we're headed into.